Hello everyone and welcome to the second 2024 edition of the SideswipeMMA betting podcast. For those of you who don't know me, I post written breakdowns of every UFC card from a betting perspective on Reddit, and I've recently branched out into recording podcast versions for those who would prefer to listen to the content rather than read it. Obviously we're all here for UFC 297, but before we break down that card, I just wanted to give a quick recap of some of my bets from the last event. UFC Vegas 84 was an okay start to the year for me. I won a bet on Joshua Van, but lost on Matthew Semmelsberger and Ricky Simone by decision, which resulted in a loss of 0.9 units on the night. However, with Marcus McGhee cashing the first leg of a parlay, which also includes a fighter from UFC 297, I'm expecting to come away with profit when everything's said and done, so I'm not really bothered that I'm a little bit in the red and that was a losing event, quote unquote. Personally, however, I do think it was a bit of a disappointing card in terms of my reads. I think I did a good job of highlighting some of the favourites that should underperform. I warned people off Tom Nolan and warned people off Cortez Acosta being a successful KO artist, but my own bets and my own reads on Semmelsberger and Simone certainly cancelled that out because those fights did not play out the way I expected them to at all. I am, however, happy with my unit sizing, as obviously those two losing bets were 1 and 1.5 unit, whereas the others were 3 units. So I put my money in the spots I was more confident in, and I've obviously minimised the loss as a result, which I'm very happy with. Alright, so UFC 297 is obviously our first pay-per-view of the year, which makes it a really interesting one for me because it gives me the opportunity to exercise some new betting rules that I've basically set for myself. So for those of you who didn't read my 2023 performance review a few weeks ago, I basically identified that I actually perform much worse on pay-per-view cards than I do on fight night cards. Annoyingly, I should have already known this, as I often say in the opening paragraph of my written previews that the odds makers are a lot sharper when it comes to pay-per-view cards. There's a lot more in it for them, obviously. The stakes are going to be higher. There are going to be more eyes and more customers betting on the product, so they have to be sharper and they have to manage their liability a little bit better. Obviously, they put the lines out for these quite early in advance as well, so there's a lot more liquidity and the betting public's opinions are a lot stronger by the time we hit fight week. Also, me personally, I know that I have always been interested in rolling the dice on underdogs, especially those who are a contrarian take and going against a very public favourite, somebody that usually gets a lot of hype and doesn't deserve to, like a Paddy Pimblett, for example. He finds himself on a lot of pay-per-views, and I like to bet against somebody like him because I think he's overrated, comparing his actual skill set to his reputation and notoriety amongst the UFC fan base. So UFC 297 itself has a really fun main event, but the rest of the card is obviously built towards Canadians, which isn't really that exciting because Canada has been a notoriously underperforming nation when it comes to MMA. Apart from George St. Pierre and Rory McDonald, I don't actually think there have been a whole lot of high caliber Canadian MMA fighters. So much so that I think Felicia Spencer is probably on the Mount Rushmore of Canadian MMA, simply because she fought for a title, and I don't think many of them have. Either way, it's a UFC pay-per-view card, which means it's better than a UFC Apex card. So I'm happy to be here, I'm happy to be breaking down these fights, I'm happy to be breaking down these betting lines. Let's get into it. So in our main event of the evening, we obviously have a bout for the UFC Middleweight Championship between Sean Strickland and Dricus du Plessis. In typical fashion, I am once again going to hold my hands up and say that I don't think this is a fight that I really want to get involved in from a betting perspective, simply because I think Dricus du Plessis is an absolute wild card and an absolute anomaly at this stage, because the last performance that he showed against Robert Whittaker was completely different from everything else we've seen in his UFC career, and I don't know what to think. So let's be honest, I did it, you did it, we all put minus 400 Robert Whittaker into our parlays because we thought we knew who Dricus du Plessis was. The guy who got soundly beaten by Derek Brunson in round 1, the guy who struggled to beat Darren Till, who's pretty much washed at this stage, and the guy who went to a pretty competitive decision win against Brad Tavares. That same guy told us to go fuck ourselves and dominated Robert Whittaker, a former champion and one of the best middleweights we've ever seen. He dominated him and he finished him in the second round, which is something that not many people have done to Robert Whittaker except for Israel Adesanya. So the fighter that we saw in that fight was just night and day, completely different from all of the aforementioned bouts against Till, Brunson and Tavares. So really what I think I'm looking at here is a guy making his sophomore appearance in the UFC, having had a good debut, if that makes sense. And if this was, a fight in the prelims and that was the situation I was looking at, I would very simply say that I'm not too sure about him yet. I'm still trying to figure him out. So yeah, I'm just very hesitant to get involved in this one. Although, for all the uncertainty that there is around Dricus du Plessis, there's a lot of certainty around Sean Strickland. You know exactly what you're going to get from him. Disciplined striking that mostly contains straight shots, his hands terrifyingly low, and just a general grittiness inside the cage that will test the cardio of many fighters, and obviously a loud mouth, and he'll like to talk to people inside the cage, which is probably what he'll do against du Plessis as well, given that they have that narrative after the brawl at the last pay-per-view. I do think that highlighting the cardio is something that could play a factor here, as the only real sort of strong conviction I have in this fight is that I think Strickland should be favoured to win the later rounds. Therefore, the only real bet that I could probably circle here and say it's worth a go is probably betting on Sean Strickland to win in rounds 4, 5 or by decision. I think that his cardio is still superior to Dricus du Plessis even after the nose surgery, and just the way that both men fight, if Sean Strickland's made it that far, he's probably made it competitive and has just kept Dricus du Plessis on the end of his jab. So by the time we hit rounds 4 and 5, I would imagine Strickland would probably have won one round at least by that point, resulting in him being favoured to win rounds 4 and 5, therefore winning the majority of the fight and therefore the decision. So yeah, no strong opinions from me. That's the only prop I would potentially be interested in, but I'm not really that committed to it. I think this is just a very obvious pass, considering Dricus du Plessis could be that guy who had the hilarious bodylock fail against Brad Tavares, or he could be the guy who styled on Robert Whittaker. Honestly, at this stage, I wouldn't be surprised to see either one. Strickland is the more reliable of the two, but he also isn't particularly reliable given the way that he actually fights. He's a bit of a meathead, keeps his hands way too low, which should make him a prime target for a Dricus du Plessis knockout in the same way that Alex Pereira did. There's just a whole lot of reasons to not get involved in this fight. So I know it's a pay-per-view main event, and I know a lot of people love Sean Strickland. He's like the right-wing poster boy, which means that a lot of people are very passionate about him, especially with some of the mental health stuff that he started talking about, which, by the way, is the biggest fucking hypocrisy. But anyway, whatever. Yeah, Sean Strickland, people love him, people want to talk about this fight, but I honestly believe that anyone who is talking really confidently about this is missing the point. I think Dricus du Plessis is very confusing. I don't really know what we're going to get from him. So yeah, it's a pass from me. And in our co-main event, we have a fight for the Women's Bantamweight Championship as Raquel Pennington faces Mayra Bueno Silva. A lot of people aren't going to be very excited for this one, but I actually am genuinely quite interested to see how this goes down, but only really because I've done the research and done the tape for it. So, honestly, I can't believe Raquel Pennington has actually managed to find her way to a title shot. Like, I remember when she was on Tough 18, which was hosted by Rousey and Tate as the coaches. That season also included people like Shayna Baszler and Jessamine Duke, who, if you're a WWE fan, those are actually quite prominent names in the Divas divisions, I think. Pennington only even got to the semi-finals of that show, and she lost out to Jessica Rakowski. I honestly don't even know who that is. So, yeah, to think that Pennington entered the UFC as a failed tough contestant, had 5 losses in her UFC career, and has actually managed to get herself to a title shot, I think is pretty insane. I think it's also insane when you consider the way that Raquel Pennington fights. She's always fought the same way, and it's never been, like, super impressive or technical. She's quite well-rounded, but she's like a B- in literally everything, but she's just hard to trump in any one particular area. Her best asset is, like, her enthusiasm and her willingness to brawl and be scrappy. It's the reason that she's won 5 fights in a row and gotten to the top. She hasn't really styled on anyone apart from the finish that she got over Macy Chasson. But when you look at the statistics of those last 5 fights, she's outlanded pretty much all of her opponents, and by quite a clear margin as well. Like I just sort of said about Sean Strickland, sometimes just having that basic style of having a fundamental and sticking with it and running with it, sometimes that can be enough. And Mayra Bueno Silva, on the reverse, is completely the opposite to that. She's very finish-orientated. She relies on powerful strikes and dangerous submissions to get her where she wants to be. And honestly, submitting Holly Holm in her last fight is a very impressive result. I know that's been turned into a no contest because of some, like, mental health medication, I think it was, but I think that's just a load of bullshit and that she deserves that win. Holly Holm has been incredibly durable in her UFC career, so to actually get a finish on her and actually get it quite commanding and quite early is really impressive. Bueno Silva has found a finish in 5 of her 6 wins, including that win over Holly Holm, whilst her record in fights that go the distance is 1 win, 1 loss, and 1 draw. And also, to go one further, during those 3 decisions, she also dropped a round to Wu Yanan 18 months ago. I think I bet Bueno Silva to win inside the distance in that fight, expecting her to absolutely steamroll Wu Yanan, because Wu Yanan's not good. So, honestly, thinking about what her capabilities are from a minute-winning perspective, Mayra Bueno Silva, that is, it's not the best look. And I think against someone like Raquel Pennington, that could be a dangerous thing, considering that enthusiasm and that willingness to be scrappy and just be in the opponent's face. So the conundrum here really becomes whether or not Mayra Bueno Silva can hurt or finish Pennington, because I think she might need to. I think Mayra Bueno Silva is a bit too hittable, and she's too happy to take a shot to turn the fight into a slugfest. I just don't think you could trust that in a 25-minute sparring session. And the idea of trusting a women's MMA fighter to hit their path to victory via a finish is obviously a bit of an anomaly and a bit of a spooky prospect anyway, considering that finishes are obviously quite rare and hard to come by in women's MMA. However, Mayra Bueno Silva has kind of disproved that throughout her entire career. I've never seen a women's MMA fighter be such a potent finisher, especially against some of the people she has beat. Like, I did not think she would get the finish over Holly Holm at all. But on the flip side, Raquel Pennington is fucking tough herself. Like, if you watch that fight she had for the title against Amanda Nunes, she took an absolute beating for 23 minutes, and it was only like a rogue elbow that kind of got through the guard in the 23rd minute that made her quit. And before that, she was absolutely tough as nails. It was almost impressive to watch how well she took a beating. So yeah, I think from a betting perspective, Mayra Bueno Silva deserves to be a moderate favourite here. Just that finishing ability will definitely be a threat, but also with the way that judging is done these days, the dangerousness that she has with her submissions and her powerful striking should also be able to swing a round or two in her favour. She also has the cardio to keep the pressure on and keep that style going for a fair few rounds, so I don't think she's going to fade in the same way that I think the finisher Indricus du Plessis will fall off a cliff as time goes by. I do, however, see Mayra Bueno Silva's flaws. I don't think she's the complete fighter, and I think that it wouldn't take much for Pennington to really turn that into a competitive fight, because if you tell me that Pennington doesn't get hurt or submitted by anything, I think this one probably deserves to see Raquel the favourite, just because of her enthusiasm and her completeness in terms of winning minutes and winning rounds. So yeah, the idea of banking on a woman to finish a woman's fight, despite her record, is an idea that kind of spooks me a little. So I don't really know how much confidence you can have in Mayra Bueno Silva. For that reason, I think she should probably be around minus 150 with that finishing upside, with Raquel Pennington therefore being plus 150 on the return. Therefore, I don't really see any value on this fight, and I don't really want to get involved in it. It's a pass for me. If you wanted a value prop bet to play, Pennington by decision would probably be what I would go for, but I won't be betting it myself because, as I said earlier, I want to have less involvement with underdogs on the pay-per-view cards this year because I feel like I overdid it last year. So yeah, no bet for me, but should be an interesting one stylistically. And next up we have Neil Magny versus Canada's Mike Malott. Now, this is exactly the kind of spot I'm talking about when I say that I want to be betting on less underdogs on pay-per-view cards, because my brain is screaming at me, telling me that there is value on Neil Magny here. I just do not rate Mike Malott as a well-rounded MMA fighter, and I've actually tried pretty hard to fade him in his UFC career so far. Obviously, I've not had any success in doing that, but I've seen enough on tape, and if he has not changed dramatically in between these fights, then his time will come. It's tricky with these kind of hype trains because, honestly, I feel like I can see the demise coming a mile away, but you just don't know when. You just don't know when it's going to happen and who the opponent is going to be that's going to capitalize it. And suddenly, because of it, you start to overrate the chances of all of their upcoming opponents being the one to do it. I did this with Randy Brown and Jack Della Maddalena at the start of last year. I think it was probably the first card I ever did a breakdown for, and I was really quite confident in Randy Brown, saying that he was going to be able to have a big grappling advantage in the fight. And honestly, in hindsight, I really overrated how willing Randy Brown is to initiate grappling simply because I thought Jack Della Maddalena's grappling was so bad. I did get that validation, and we all saw that I was onto something at the time. And by the way, a bet on Gilbert Burns is definitely on the horizon. But I still let my desire to fade Jack Della Maddalena cloud my judgment when I should have known that Randy Brown wasn't the guy with the skill set to tackle that easy advantage that he had. And I think this is kind of the same with Neil Magny versus Mike Malott here. Mike Malott on the feet is hittable as fuck. He relies so much on his power and being the first one to land that KO shot that he's happy to just lose minutes as a result and get pieced up himself. He's got a really good chin, but his striking is really not that. He was getting cleanly beaten on the feet by Mickey Gall 3 fights ago. Like, who has Mickey Gall ever beaten on the feet in a UFC fight apart from CM Punk? It's a terrible look, and honestly, I cannot believe that we've gotten to a point where Mike Malott is minus 250 against a veteran like Neil Magny. I know that Malott also does have redeeming qualities in that he's dangerous with his grappling and that he has really impressive BJJ, but Magny's also not a slouch in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu department. You can look at his record, and yes, he has had a lot of submission losses, but let me read out the names of those people. Gilbert Burns, Shavkat Rakhmonov, Rafael dos Anjos, Damian Maia, Sergio Moraes. Honestly, those are some of the cream of the crop in terms of like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ability that we've ever seen in the UFC, period. Is Mike Malott up to the challenge? Is he good enough to do that? He could be. I don't know. I think the jury's kind of out because Mike Malott has kind of just grappled and styled on guys whose BJJ definitely isn't there. People like Johan Lainesse in his last fight. So really, I think it's a bit of an educated guess and you're just sort of hoping he is if you're going to bet that. But having said all of that, Magny is definitely on the decline, seemingly for the second time in his career. I remember when he got absolutely pieced up by Santiago Ponzinibbio in like 2017 and everyone was like, Neil Magny is washed. And he took like 2 years off, came back and then went on like a win streak. It was pretty bizarre. But these days, when you look at Neil Magny in 2024, he's just so uninspiring in the way that he fights. He relies on clever tactics, cage pushing, like the veteran savvy, and just general mediocrity in his fights to get him past fighters who aren't as well-rounded as him. Could he do that here? I think he genuinely could, but Magny just doesn't give anyone the confidence that he's going to go out there and fight for your money. I mean, he went to a split decision against Phil Rowe, which is pretty bad, and he also got absolutely embarrassed by Ian Gary. It just wasn't a good look, and I don't think Neil Magny is the guy that you want to be trusting to fight prospects, and I think we saw that in that Gary fight. So yeah, I definitely don't think Mike Malott deserves to be minus 250 in a fight like this, but it doesn't make me want to play Neil Magny on the reverse. It's as simple as that, honestly. Like, I look at the money line and I'm just like, I don't feel comfortable betting on either side in this fight. I don't necessarily know where the line should be, but both of them scream yikes to me, so I don't understand why you would want to get involved. Sure, Mike Malott will probably end up winning, but I'd be surprised if Neil Magny looks like a plus 250 underdog in this spot, even if he goes on to sort of lose a tepid 29-28 decision or whatever it is. So yeah, this is me showing growth as a bettor. I don't want to be betting on Neil Magny in a spot like this, so I don't have a bet on this fight at all. Our next main card bout is between Chris Curtis and Canada's Marc-Andre Barriault in the middleweight division. And if this one's like any of Chris Curtis's recent UFC fights, it's probably going to contain a headbutt, as Chris Curtis's last two fights have both been severely impacted by headbutts. I bet on Kelvin Gastelum and was very lucky to get away with that headbutt not being seen because it pretty much won Kelvin the fight. And I also bet on Nassourdine Imavov, who was dominating Curtis before the headbutt ruled it a no contest, which was obviously very frustrating. So peaks and troughs, I can't really complain overall. But anyway, back to this fight. I don't really have a whole lot to say about it because honestly I think it's just a really well-matched bout and it's a great piece of matchmaking. It's two guys who bring a very similar style to the table, and I think it's very hard to distinguish between them pre-fight. They both like striking, they both don't really look to actively grapple themselves, but they've got good defensive traits in the grappling department. So I think we're going to get a 15-minute stand-up affair here, which is never really a prospect that you want to be looking into from a betting perspective, unless there's clearly a level between them, which in this case I don't think there is. So the next thing I would do in that instance would be to lean towards the statistics and see what historically both men have been capable of. And the numbers themselves really back up the point that I'm trying to make in that I think this one's going to be very close. They have very similar average significant strikes landed per minute, with Curtis at 5.36 and Barriault at 5.95. And on the return, both men get hit an equal amount too. There's a slight advantage to Marc-Andre Barriault there, as Curtis actually somehow has a negative strike differential. You have to be careful with statistics though, because obviously most of those came from the Jack Hermansson fight, which was just a bizarre performance from Curtis where he looked like shit. Pretty much an anomaly because he doesn't usually fight like that. In terms of the power dynamic between the two on the feet, I do give an advantage there to Chris Curtis, which, given that I gave the striking metric advantage to Barriault, kind of swings this one back to a pick'em in my opinion. It's just a really tricky fight between two similarly flawed brawlers. I'm happy to just watch this one, enjoy the chaos, and not really put too much energy into thinking about betting it. I always say that the hardest fights to call are between two similar opponents, which I think it's a very obvious statement that explains itself. But I think that the statistics back this one up, and the eye test does too. So really, I just don't really understand why someone would have a real keen conviction to want to get involved in this one from a betting perspective. If I had to lean towards anything, it would probably be the overs, because both men have been pretty durable, and I don't really think that either man has thunderous one-punch KO power, so I would expect this one to go over and to sort of set into a slightly aggressive sparring kind of fight across 15 minutes. So I am interested to see what the overs look like on this fight, but aside from that, I really don't have any interest in putting my money on it. Elsewhere on the main card, we have a really exciting fight between England's Arnold Allen versus Russia's Movsar Evloev. It's a very, very fun fight that I've actually wanted to see for quite some time. Unfortunately, whilst I have been excited to watch it, I've always had this feeling that it would actually be quite an easy fight for Movsar Evloev, because I think that it's a bit of a stylistic nightmare for someone like Arnold Allen, because low-key, he's not a very good defensive wrestler. So statistically, when you look at things, he has a 76% takedown defense rate, which obviously isn't bad at all. But this is the featherweight division. Arnold Allen hasn't faced a fighter with a primarily wrestling-based skill set for a good few years since he fought Nick Lentz. And ironically, that was a fight that he defended 9 of 9 takedowns, but it didn't stop him from getting pushed against the fence and physically controlled a lot by Lentz when Lentz was fresh. Lentz did kind of take a dip in second and third rounds, which allowed Arnold Allen to turn the tide. But against a high-level opponent that's got better cardio, which we know Movsar Evloev does have, I think that he could really struggle. It's kind of the same take that I had regarding Ricky Simone and Mario Bautista last week. I was very confident that Mario Bautista may have the ability to get back to his feet or stop the takedowns, but at the end of the day, he was still going to be on the back foot and was going to be bullied around the cage, so that it would be very hard for him to look like the winning fighter, simply because he was being positionally controlled, regardless of whether or not that meant takedowns or not. I've said it before, but I think that featherweight is actually quite a boring division when it comes to the UFC, because most of the fights in the top 15 are just long-distance kickboxing affairs. If you think about all of the main events that we had in 2023, so many of them were just top 15ers from featherweight going 25 minutes. And that is a world that Arnold Allen has been able to thrive in, because obviously he is a very good striker. When you look at someone like Movsar Evloev, on the other hand, he's one of the very few that disrupts that narrative. He lands almost 5 takedowns per fight and ragdolling some of the division's most well-rounded names on the come-up. The likes of Dan Ige, Hakeem Dawodu, and even Diego Lopez are some of his most recent victims, and none of them were able to challenge him on a minute-to-minute basis. They all got steamrolled over 15 minutes. Diego Lopez obviously came very close with some of the finishes that he was threatening, but that's not really a dangerousness that I expect Arnold Allen to have here, especially considering most of it was like guard submissions. I don't think Arnold Allen's got that in his locker at all, especially against a Russian like Evloev. In my opinion, I just think that this is a deserving favourite spot for Movsar Evloev, because I don't think he's significantly outmatched in one particular area of MMA. Yes, Arnold Allen is probably the better striker if they are going to kickbox for 15 minutes, but Evloev is going to be right there with him. I think Evloev is a very underrated striker, and also you have to remember that when you have someone who's such a prolific wrestler, it changes the approach that the striker-based opponent is going to have. They're going to be scared of that takedown shot. They're not going to be able to throw with such power, such ferocity, and such enthusiasm as they usually do. There have been so many fights where striker versus grappler and the striker looks very gun-shy. And to back up that claim about Evloev's striking, he actually has a better striking accuracy than Arnold Allen, and also a higher volume, which are two very good metrics when you consider that the Russian is very likely to go for a full 15 minutes. So I think this one should be pretty 50-50 in the striking exchanges, and obviously the wrestling, positional control and everything else clearly favours Movsar Evloev. Therefore, I think he deserves to be a moderate favourite, just under minus 200. With that in mind, I saw one UK book was offering Movsar Evloev at minus 150 a few weeks ago. That's very likely to be the fact that Arnold Allen is a UK guy, therefore a lot of the money is going to be on him, a lot of the liability is too, so they were able to offer a more generous price just to get ahead of the damage control that there's going to be when a UK guy ends up on a pay-per-view. So I think there's still a tiny bit of value left on Evloev at around minus 170 mark, but it's not a whole lot for me to recommend a bet at that price tag. I was happy to jump in at minus 150, but I probably would pass if all I could get was minus 170. Along with that, I do think that there's probably going to be a decent spot to bet Evloev by decision, seeing as he has very little fight-ending potential. Arnold Allen is very tough. And yeah, I just think that minute winning is something that Evloev does better than most people in the division. So if you get plus 100 or better on Movsar Evloev to win by decision, I think you definitely should take it. I took Movsar Evloev at minus 150 for 1 unit, and I will probably have 0.5 units on that Evloev decision win if it's plus 100 or better. So it'll be 1.5 units on Evloev in total. That's my first bet of the card. Next up, we have another Canadian in action as recent Ultimate Fighter winner Brad Katona faces Garrett Armfield. I see that Brad Katona continues to be seriously underrated here by looking at this betting line. To me, Brad Katona is a really talented fighter and was absolutely UFC caliber back in 2019 when they cut him for losing to Hunter Azure and Merab Dvalishvili. I feel like everyone should get a pass for losing to Merab Dvalishvili because that's just an insane fight, especially so early in your UFC career. Obviously, I think one of the reasons that Katona did get axed quite quickly is because he's a pretty boring fighter to watch. He's very happy to wrestle, he's happy to coast at distance on the feet, and honestly, his method of victory record looks like a women's MMA record with how likely he is to go the distance. He did show a different side to that in his Ultimate Fighter finale win most recently, though. He definitely put on a show for the fans, and it's quite unlike him to do that. But honestly, I don't care. Like, obviously, when you're a better first and a fan second, you shouldn't give a shit if a fighter is boring, because if they are boring, they're probably likely to produce results, and that means winning bets. So Brad Katona faces Garrett Armfield here, who is a 1-1 UFC fighter with a 9-3 professional record. The losses in his career have come against quite notable names by UFC standards. So firstly, David Onama, who I would say is a UFC caliber fighter, but isn't anything special. Ronnie Lawrence, who is a UFC caliber fighter, but isn't really anything special. And Matteo Vogel, who fought on the recent Contender Series season and did not get awarded a contract. To me, that kind of already shows where Garrett Armfield's ceiling is, and it shows he's probably not someone who's going to be pushing the top 15 or maybe even surviving in the company over numerous years. To go one further in digging up Armfield's records, the opponents that he beat on the regional scene, combined record of 34 wins and 42 losses when they faced him. Trash. The tape is all that matters in reality though, but it didn't really do much except confirm what I was already suspecting. From watching Armfield's fight against Onama, the best compliment I can really give him is that he's committed. He kept walking forward and he used decent combos and some sort of herky-jerky movement to find a counter. And then when he was on the mat, he tried to get out of the positions that he got put in. But honestly, I just was not impressed. I think he got soundly beaten in that Onama fight, and it wasn't really that impressive. In fairness to Armfield, he did look improved in that win against Kazama, using those same combinations and weird movement to overwhelm a very flat-footed opponent who didn't really seem to understand what head movement was or how to avoid a 1-2 combo. Credit to Armfield for looking good in that one, but honestly, I think you'd have to go a long way to find an active UFC-level fighter who wouldn't absolutely destroy Kazama on the feet. Brad Katona would absolutely embarrass Kazama. In regards to Brad's recent performances, Armfield is basically a worse version of Cody Gibson. Cody Gibson brings a lot of the same tools and looks on the feet as Garrett Armfield does, and we saw how good Katona looked in that fight. In this fight as well, he's going to have a massive speed advantage, and he should just be able to do a better job in the striking department across all facets. I think he's the more diverse fighter, the quicker fighter. He'll mix things up a lot better as well, and those takedowns will definitely be there when he needs to. The only thing I think really lies in Armfield's favour is obviously power, which I think is something you could say for pretty much every opponent Brad Katona faces. And honestly, I think that's the only serious path to victory you can really give Garrett Armfield here. So, in short, I basically ask you, why is a man who has beaten Timur Valiev, Bryce Mitchell and Kyler Phillips, why is he only a -163 favourite to a jobber who isn't going to last very long in the UFC and already has a 1-1 record? I think there's insane recency bias here because Armfield looked good in that Kazama fight. I don't understand this line at all, honestly. I don't think that Armfield is worth anything. I don't think he's going to have a serious career in the UFC, and I think Katona absolutely can. I think if Katona had not got cut when he lost to Merab and Hunter Azure, I think he probably would still be in the UFC. He might not have, hit the top 15 or won a title or anything like that, but I think he is UFC level, and I think he's going to show it in this fight by being given a serious step down in competition. I think that Katona should probably be -300 here. For that reason, I have a 3-unit bet on Brad Katona at -163, because I think it's ridiculous. Simple as that, really. It's in a price range where I can play it straight, so I've played it straight instead of using it as a parlay. Brad Katona all day. And in our next fight, we have a really fun one between two capable and dangerous strikers as Charles Jourdain faces Sean Woodson. To give you a basic summary, I think that Charles Jourdain is the better fighter of the two and has proven himself to be more capable in the UFC, having fought a higher caliber of opponents and had more success in doing so. But Sean Woodson is a unique opponent because he's basically Slenderman and he has a ridiculous 9-inch reach advantage here. Perhaps it's a cop-out to say this, but Sean Woodson fights are incredibly hard to analyse because of his size. You can watch all the striking tape you want on his opponent, but they've likely never faced a physical challenge like this, and therefore it's more or less impossible to know how they're going to handle that reach differential. If you are watching a fight between two strikers and they've got a very similar reach, there are so many nuances that are going to be really different when they fight someone who has a much bigger reach. How they approach it, how they manage distance, things like that. that honestly it kind of makes it redundant. So the first thing I had to do was go through Charles Jourdain's record and see if I could find a fight where he had a significant reach disadvantage against an opponent. Thankfully, we did manage to find the Shane Burgos fight where there was a 6-inch reach disadvantage for the Canadian. It's not quite the same, but it's significant enough that it gives a good indication of how Charles Jourdain deals with that kind of adversity. I think that he definitely held his own in that fight. He opted to fight at distance, which was a really curious choice. He welcomed the pressure of Shane Burgos and he used kicks to throw him off balance and circle out as a result. He did let himself down in the grappling department though, allowing someone like Burgos, who has never really historically shown to have much of a grappling game. He found the back really easily on multiple occasions in that fight, and it was pretty eye-opening and showed where Charles Jourdain is at from a grappling perspective, seeing as we've also seen him struggle against the likes of Andre Fili on the mat before. The question is though, did Burgos have success against Jourdain because of the size, or was it just because Jourdain's not a particularly good grappler? Because if it's the former, Sean Woodson has a real path to victory here if he's going to look to grapple against Jourdain with that massive frame advantage. However, the comparisons kind of end there, and I think it is fair to say that Woodson is nowhere near as good as Burgos is as a striker by any stretch of the imagination. And just because Jourdain struggled with the certain things against Burgos, it doesn't mean that Woodson's capable of bringing that same thing to the table, because you can have all of the similarities physically, but you have to have the skill set to be able to execute the same things. I think that Jourdain showed against Burgos that he knows how to overcome a reach disadvantage on the feet, and he can be well prepared and well drilled for it. So I don't expect him to get stuck on the end of Woodson's jab like many other opponents do and just become a deer in the headlights. So there's arguments for both men really, but I still think that the most abundantly clear point is that Jourdain has just proven himself to be a more capable fighter overall, and from having looked at that Burgos fight, you can see that he's someone who's able to make adjustments on the fly to tailor his approach so that it matches that of his opponent. Look at the way that he handled Kron Gracie most recently, for example. It's a hard statement to quantify saying that somebody is just more capable than another, but if you look at Woodson's record, it really does come through. He's already dropped the ball against the likes of Luis Saldana, who is absolutely nobody. I don't think you need to look much further to conclude that he should therefore be an underdog against Jourdain simply for that reason. However, again, Jourdain isn't really a guy that I'm interested in trusting as a moderate favourite simply because of that grappling disadvantage that he's likely to have here. His takedown defense will always be a liability. It's cost him quite a few fights when he probably should have been able to get the win, like in that Burgos fight, and maybe even like in that Andre Fili fight. Against a big size disadvantage, it might not even matter how good or bad Woodson is in comparison to Jourdain on a skill level, because we have weight classes for a reason, and height comes into that as well as just weight. So yeah, it's a tricky fight to handicap, but I do think that Jourdain should probably be given slight favoritism. The size is weird. The way that Jourdain approached the size of Burgos was a little bit weird. The difference in both men's good and bad performances is also weird. It's all just a weird fight. So just let the Canadians bang, enjoy the show. Don't really say anything more about it. I won't be betting it personally, but I think the line's kind of accurate where it is, with Jourdain as a slight favourite. I would have him at minus 150. He's currently at minus 175, so it's all kind of the same. No bet from me on this one. So next up we have a double debut as Seri Sidey takes on Ramon Taveras. And full disclosure, I had absolutely no idea who either of these guys were when I saw that this fight got put together. It turns out they fought on Dana White's Contender Series in the recent season, and Sidey won via a dodgy referee stoppage, which Dana White visibly disagreed with. They let Sidey into the UFC, but they gave Taveras another opportunity to make amends, which he emphatically took with a KO in under 30 seconds, and now we have the rematch that nobody asked for on a pay-per-view. It's a very small sample size, but I actually thought that Taveras was clearly demonstrating that he was the superior striker of the two in that very brief first fight. Sidey's offense was very kick-based, whilst Taveras was landing clean shots that were pretty much straight shots the entire time with the occasional lead hook. Although he didn't hurt Sidey, he really could have, and the sound and the power that he was throwing with was a really good look. Honestly, I was just much more impressed with him in the very brief moments we saw there. So this rematch will obviously take place in front of a home crowd for Sidey, but whilst I think a lot of people think that's an advantage, I think it can very easily add a negative spin because there's pressure and a home crowd means that his family are probably going to be there. There's expectation. Everyone wants him to win. Whereas Taveras just has to come in, do what he usually does and play spoiler. It doesn't mean that much to me, but I imagine that there'll be some people who are leaning on that to justify why Sidey's a favourite here. I don't really like the idea of it, especially considering it is a lower level affair and this basically is a contender series fight. But I think there's clear value on Taveras here. We got the privilege of seeing a small sample size of what this fight should look like. And whilst Sidey landed a knockdown and did get the finish, I was much more impressed with Taveras. He wasn't hurt really when he hit the floor, and I think he would have been able to survive that encounter. I don't really know what his grappling is like. I don't really know what Sidey's grappling is like, but assuming they got back to the feet, I think he would have been able to carry on just fine. The commentators did allude to the fact that Sidey had a grappling advantage, but that could ring true, but the ego probably will get involved here. And considering that they had a controversial end to the fight, there's been a bit of bad blood. There's been a bit of trash talk on social media since then. I think we're probably going to get a striking fight for the fans. And with that in mind, I just don't really see why this fight isn't lined a lot closer. I can understand Sidey being the favourite because he got the win, but if the fight had ended via an illegal groin shot or something and had been a no contest, I would rank Taveras as the favourite in a rematch. Probably something like -125, -130. So with that in mind, I think I kind of have to take a small stab on Ramon Taveras. I don't really love the idea of doing it, but it is the first and only underdog that I'm playing on the entire card. Spoiler alert. So I don't really mind getting involved for a unit. So I have one unit on Ramon Taveras to win at +163. And next up, we have the first Canadian female on the card as Gillian Robertson faces Polyana Viana. I've been pretty confident in my read on Polyana Viana for a long time now. I think she's a pretty easy fighter to read. To me, she is dangerous with recently developing striking and historically guard submission ability, but she lacks all sort of process, and all of her stoppage wins just sort of present themselves out of nowhere. There doesn't seem to be any sort of like methodical setup or like visual display of dominance in the build-up to a finish. It just sort of appears out of nowhere. And on the reverse, it doesn't take much to beat her at all. With her winning equity being so finish-based via guard submissions or striking, if you take her down and sit in half guard, you've basically won the fight. You just need to do that 3 times across 15 minutes and you are victorious. It is a very easy method of victory. And honestly, I can't understand how anyone has lost to her in the UFC at this level. So that was exactly the breakdown I wrote when Viana was going to fight Emily Ducote, and I was betting on Emily Ducote before that fight got cancelled. It was exactly the breakdown I wrote when I confidently bet on Jasmine Lucindo to get the finish over Polyana Viana, and it's exactly the breakdown I'm giving you now for this Gillian Robertson fight. So as I said, a grappling skill set is going to be what's useful here. Gillian Robertson is probably one of the most efficient grapplers that women's MMA has ever seen. Her striking is bad and her wrestling is decent, but she's very reliable to attempt takedowns, and once she gets that top position, there are few in the division that could prevent the upcoming submission, let alone find a way back to their feet. So to me, this one seems really cut and dry, and for the second fight in a row, I really cannot understand why Gillian Robertson is only -150 here. I understand that Robertson has her flaws, and she's never going to be champion, and she has a one-dimensional skill set. And also, to make matters worse, when she loses, she usually gets dominated pretty hard and it looks pretty bad. That's what happened to her against Tabitha Ritchie. It's what happened to her against Macy Barber. It's what happened to her against Tyler Santos. But that Tabitha Ritchie fight is obviously the one that's dictating the line here. And Tabitha Ritchie is a competent wrestler herself, which immediately takes away Robertson's main path to victory. And Ritchie had a massive striking advantage to demonstrate once she established that she was going to keep it standing. So obviously that made Robertson look way worse than she really is, because she was fighting an opponent that very early on demonstrated that she had all the tools to shut down what Gillian does well. That's all to our benefit here, though, because I think Polyana Viana is one of the worst women's MMA fighters we've ever seen in the UFC, and the fact that she's survived 5 years and 9 fights is honestly pretty shocking. I genuinely think that stylistically this is the easiest fight Gillian Robertson has had in the UFC, aside from Priscilla Cachoeira quite recently, where she tried to gouge her in the eye, and in that fight Gillian Robertson was -350. So why is Robertson not -350 in this spot? I genuinely think the only reason for it is because Ritchie made her look bad, and I don't think that that's something that's relevant here at all. She went up against somebody in that fight who had wrestling capabilities, whereas here she's fighting Viana, who has 43% takedown defense and has 2 submission losses at a UFC level against less prolific finishers and grapplers than Gillian Robertson. So if you read my 2023 breakdown of all of my bets and my performance, you will have read that I am a lot keener on being more aggressive on women's MMA bets this year because I feel like it's a area that I really have an edge in. I had a 13% return on investment on all women's MMA bets in 2023, which I think is a pretty solid number. So this is definitely a spot where I'm going to be going a bit more aggressive than most people would be confident in doing so. I've got 4 units on Gillian Robertson at minus 150. She's always been my girl. I'm really confident in my read on her. I think I predict the fights that she wins and the fights that she loses pretty damn well. And also the third written breakdown that I ever posted was on her to beat Sarah Frota back in 2019. So I've always got a soft spot for her. But in short, there's huge value on offer here in my opinion. She's now sat at like minus 188, which I think is still an okay line to be honest. And the submission line might be interesting as well. Given that I have exposure on the money line, I probably won't play the submission, but I don't think it's the worst thing to go for because I don't trust Polyana Viana to survive 15 minutes. Next up, we have a showdown between 2 fighters coming off a loss, and that is Canada's Johan Lainesse versus England's Sam Paterson. I have a strange obsession with betting on Johan Lainesse fights because I think he's a really easy fighter to read. His style has changed a fair bit over the years, but it's quite easy to understand why those changes have had to happen if you look at the journey that he's been on. So I actually used to really rate his round 1 KO ability and the dangerousness that he brought to the table, because honestly it was the only thing that he did well. It's how he got into the UFC. I'm saying this off the top of my head, but prior to his Dana White's Contender Series fight, I think he had 6 out of 7 victories via round 1 finish, and that's exactly how he won as a big underdog on Contender Series. So the problem with Johan Lainesse is that that's the style that got him to the dance, but he basically got neutered after his UFC debut. He fought Gabe Green and came out with that really aggressive style in round 1, looked really good, clearly won the round and did hurt Gabe, but he didn't get the finish. He then proceeded to absolutely fall apart and got pieced up by Green himself when he gassed out, and since then, he's approached fights very differently. He came into his sophomore UFC fight really gun-shy, really timid. It just looked like he was so scared of exerting any real energy because he knew he might gas out. Once you're like that as a fighter, I think it's pretty much game over for you because you can't commit to the only path to victory that you can actually pull off because cardio isn't really something that you can train and learn like a lot of other skill sets in MMA can be done. So I think that Lainesse is kind of just trumped by his inabilities. It's a shame, really, because I genuinely think that reckless and bloodthirsty round 1 Lainesse could have finished Mike Malott. And I bet him to do that in that fight as a bit of a roll of the dice. It was obviously an embarrassing bet because he got demolished on the mat and looked like a white belt. But I think that dangerous Lainesse that came into the UFC could absolutely have finished Mike Malott. And I think he absolutely could have finished Sam Paterson here because the Englishman is the definition of tall man's defense. So there is obviously a chance that Johan does find it in himself to go back to that old style, but you really can't have any confidence based on how he's looked in his last 2 fights. If that is the case, then I think Paterson could probably take inspiration from that Mike Malott performance and get his grappling going and do some impressive things in the submission world. But given that Paterson himself has incredibly bad striking defense, and if you look to his Dana White's Contender Series fight, he might have won it, but he almost got finished very early on, basically, because he was so defensively lax. So I don't really know who you trust in this fight, because both men have paths to victory that involve a finish and paths to a loss that also involve a finish. You've just got 2 equally dangerous and equally frail fighters here. In an instance like that, I think it's always a good idea to look towards the unders or the fight doesn't go to the decision. But given the way that those markets have been priced up this year, I really don't think you should expect to see a decent price tag. If I was to see something like minus 300 or minus 400, I'd be interested in using them as a parlay piece, but the chances of you getting that are pretty low. I have noticed that since initially writing this breakdown, money has come in on Johan, which makes me feel that now on the money line the value sits with Paterson, because I think it should obviously be a pick'em. It's not a fight that I'm going to be betting on because, again, I don't think you can trust either man, but if you had to be betting on anyone, it's got to be Sam Paterson. I don't understand why you would put money on Johan Lainesse at around minus 150. It's absolutely insane. And next up, we have the second Canadian female fighter on the card as Jasmine Jasudavicius takes on Priscilla Cachoeira. In my opinion, it is always Priscilla Cachoeira fade season. She is one of the rare women's MMA fighters that actually has fight-ending power, but that is literally the only thing she brings to the table other than grittiness in the striking department. It has won her a few fights against some strikers with reliability issues, but it doesn't mean shit if you're facing a grappler. Miranda Maverick and Gillian Robertson are two grapplers that made quick work of her and really laid out the blueprint of how easy it is to beat her. And I think Jasmine Jasudavicius will likely just do the exact same thing. I think of her as a very similarly skilled grappler to both Maverick and Robertson, so this doesn't seem like a more challenging task for her compared to those two women. I've actually lost a fair bit of money going against Jasudavicius in her UFC and Dana White's Contender Series career. I think I clearly have underrated her, and I've learnt my lesson as the years have gone by, watching her skill set develop. She's got a great frame for the division, and she's actually pretty well-rounded, and when those two things are combined, it makes her a very tough fighter to beat in the division. Basically, I think she's got what it takes to win this fight on the feet or on the mat, wherever she chooses. If she's got more than one brain cell, she'll look to shoot early and often because that's clearly the path of least resistance against Cachoeira. But we did see her do that against the Brazilian debutante, whose name escapes me, last year, so I am trusting that she will see sense and do the exact same thing. She currently sits at a very understandable minus 350 price tag, which some people will say is steep because it's women's MMA, but personally I think it should be steeper. I think it should definitely be minus 500. For that reason, I've used it quite aggressively in two different parlays. Firstly, in a 3-unit bet with Marcus McGhee from the UFC Vegas 84 card. That fight hasn't taken place yet at the time of recording, so I've no idea if that's still rolling or if that's a loser. But I've also used her for 3 units alongside Natalia Silva on the Delidze versus Imavov card in a couple of weeks' time. The Marcus McGhee bet is at minus 125 and the Natalia Silva bet is at minus 120. So that is 6 units in total on Jasmine Jasudavicius, which is obviously a very aggressive stance. But I do think she is the safest bet on the entire card, and I do think that there is value on her line, so I didn't mind getting involved for that much exposure. I also am toying with the idea of having a 0.5 unit bet on Jasudavicius to win by submission, simply because I think she's going to have a lot of grappling dominance in this fight, and we've already seen that Cachoeira doesn't have the capabilities to defend for 15 minutes. I know that Jasudavicius hasn't been a particularly prolific finisher in the UFC at all, but then again, neither had Miranda Maverick, and she made light work of her on the mat, so I think Jasudavicius has got a really good opportunity to go against what her record says the trend will be, and actually finding a finish instead of winning by decision. So yeah, in short, she's minus 350, she should be minus 500, there's a little bit of value there, but I think it makes for a great cornerstone if you're trying to build a parlay, so Jasmine Jasudavicius all day.
Kicking off the card, we have a strange piece of matchmaking between Malcolm Gordon and Jimmy Flick. The reason I call it strange is because both men are obviously hanging on to their UFC careers by their fingertips, and a loss probably means that whoever is on the receiving end is going to get cut. Why the UFC haven't just taken the opportunity to bolster up some emerging prospect or somebody wanting to get their UFC career off to a good start, why they haven't matched both of these guys up against one of those, I don't know. Strange. But anyway, both men look their best when they're grappling, and both men look absolutely pitiful when they're forced to strike. They are two of the worst strikers in the UFC at the moment, pound for pound, regardless of gender. I genuinely think that's true. So this one could turn into a really ugly fight if they decide that they want to stand with each other because they're scared of the grappling potential that the other one possesses. Hopefully that's not the kind of fight that we get, but it's always possible in a fight like this. But if we do get grappling, which everyone's hoping we do, I really don't know which guy should be favoured. I think Gordon has looked worse in the UFC historically, but he's also looked the best of the two of them. That loss that he had to Muhammad Mokaev, I think he actually showed some impressive things and did far better and gave a far better account of himself than a lot of people were expecting him to. Does that mean a whole lot in this fight? I don't necessarily know, but it does indicate that there's a chance that if Gordon can survive Mokaev on the mat, then he can probably survive Jimmy Flick and therefore maybe turn the tables and do something good of his own. However, Gordon is just awful. And honestly, Jimmy Flick is also awful. Both guys are awful. I don't really know who should be the favourite here. I don't even know why this fight is happening. I just don't understand why anyone would be really enthusiastic about wanting to bet this one. I don't even know why I've wasted about 2 minutes talking about it. Let's just move on. There honestly is no point in talking about this.
So there we have it. That is the first pay-per-view of the year, UFC 297, broken down from top to bottom from a betting perspective. As I always do, I'm just going to quickly run through a summary of all the bets I have placed on this card so far. So we have 1 unit on Movsar Evloev to win at minus 150. Along with a potential future 0.5 unit bet on Evloev to win by decision if it's plus 100 or better. 4 units on Gillian Robertson to win at minus 150, along with a potential 0.5 unit bet on Robertson to win by submission, if plus 200 or better. 1 unit on Ramon Taveras at plus 163. 3 units on Jasmine Jasudavicius and Marcus McGhee at minus 125. 3 units on Jasmine Jasudavicius and Natalia Silva from UFC Vegas 85 at minus 120. And potentially 0.5 units on Jasmine Jasudavicius to win by submission at plus 200 or better. And finally, 3 units on Brad Katona to win at minus 163. At this stage, I always list a few parlay pieces, which are essentially just me giving out some reliable selections that will go nicely into a parlay. And this week they are Movsar Evloev, Gillian Robertson, Jasmine Jasudavicius, Brad Katona, and Johan Lainesse versus Paterson. Fight doesn't go the distance. And my dog of the week is Ramon Taveras. So that's all from me. We've got a week's break next, I think, but after that we'll be back for the Imavov versus Dolidze card. Enjoy the UFC pay-per-view. I will catch you then. Take care.